we can start with getting a reaction to, of course, the bombshell report. I know both of you have covered this individually and on the Duran, from Seymour Hersh, the renowned multiple award-winning journalist. He uncovered or revealed U.S. involvement in the Nord Stream pipeline destruction, the sabotage that took place back in September of 2022, implicating Norway, implicating essentially all of the U.S.'s top military and intelligence officials, and also by the Biden administration taking pretty extensive lengths to skirt U.S. law itself by just primarily using U.S. naval divers, which allowed him not to discuss this matter. But I definitely want to get your reaction to this, because we know back in February when Olaf Scholz and Biden, last February, a year ago, almost today, a little over a year ago, Biden said, with Olaf Scholz right next to him, the German Chancellor Edison said, hey, to a reporter, hey, well, we'll find a way to get rid of Nord Stream 2 or to stop Nord Stream 2 from functioning. And when he was questioned again, he said, well, we'll find a way. And now we're finding out that the U.S. possibly had very extensive involvement, as many of us suspected. I know you guys have talked about. I don't know who wants to begin here, Alex or Alexander, but I definitely would love your reactions to this story, because I feel like everyone's talking about it now, and the White House, of course, is vehemently denying it.
Well, let me start. Now, I have to say this. I have been waiting to see what form those denials, because, of course, there were bound to be denials, were going to take. And I said to myself, well, let's see if one of the people who is alleged to have been involved, perhaps the director of the CIA, perhaps, Jake Sullivan or Victoria Nuland, or indeed Biden himself, is prepared to go on to the record to deny it. And they haven't, at least not that I'm aware of. The only people who are denying it are spokespeople who are fairly low down in the food chain. And I have to say, I think that's very indicative. So William Burns, the CIA director, who I would have thought would be the obvious person to come out, give a press conference, say this story is completely untrue, something like that, he's remained silent. And that, frankly, settles it as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's what we always suspected. The circumstantial detail is very great. One must be very careful not to simply believe a story, because the circumstantial detail is extensive. I mean, that's a flaw in the methodology, but it is, in this case, it correlates very, very closely with the actual known sequence of facts. And I have to say, looking at all over, I think it's true. So that's the first thing to say. And I'd say there's three further points to make, and I'll say them briefly. Firstly, Biden is up to his ears in this thing. He was the central decision maker. He was involved in making these decisions all along. That's one. Secondly, the planning began weeks before the war started. We're not talking about an event that was precipitated by the war. Detailed planning began in December, if you believe Hersh, which, as I said, I do, and that's weeks before there was a war, at a time when the diplomacy suggested that there wouldn't be a war. And thirdly, and perhaps the most serious point of all, the really important one for me, is the one, Danny, that you just made, which is that they looked for ways to get round the law and to bypass Congress. They didn't want to tell Congress what they were doing, not even the whole of Congress, just this group of 8 people who are supposed to be kept informed. Now, I think that's a very serious matter. Bear in mind, the Constitution says that it's Congress that has the power to declare war. This is, as anybody with any knowledge of law, international law, will tell you, this is an act of war. It is an act of war not just against Russia, but arguably against Germany, one of the US's most critically important allies as well. And yet the President of the United States, his foreign policy team, his head of the CIA. They all got together. They did it. They did it in a way intended to circumvent the law. I would say that was illegal. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I'd say that was unconstitutional as well. It seems to me an incredibly serious matter. It tells you how utterly reckless these people have become. It also tells you the extraordinary sense of impunity that they feel, and that they can do these sort of things and feel that they can get away with them. And about the last, unfortunately, they are probably, at least for the moment, right. Because where is the outcry? Where are the complaints? Where is the protests, the huge numbers of protests in Congress? Maybe I'm not getting, the full picture living as I do in Britain, but in Britain, this is a non-story, barely reported in the American editions of some British newspapers, but not really in the British editions at all. The British public doesn't know about this. The German public, perhaps they're a bit more informed, but not much. Scholz isn't complaining, not in any real sense. Germany isn't complaining. Congress isn't complaining. So the president plotted in open sight, basically, to break the law of the United States and commit an act of war affecting a US ally, and he's going to get away with it. Everybody's going to let him do it.
Yeah, 100% what Alexander said. And I think the one thing that this article shows us, if you believe what Hersh is reporting, it's that these four individuals, they're running the show. I mean, they are running the Ukraine war. These are the four individuals that are managing this conflict, no doubt about it. And most likely, Hersh's source, in my opinion, is probably someone in the military, probably someone in the Pentagon, who is trying to find a way to stop this insanity. That would be my hunch. But if you want to know who's driving this bus, it is these four individuals. And first and foremost, it's Biden. This article shows that Biden is a neocon. He always was a neocon. He hasn't changed. He's been for war and conflicts going all the way back to Serbia, all the way through to Iraq and Libya and Syria, and now Ukraine. And I think all of these individuals also have some sort of emotional vested interest in Ukraine, which is what makes it even more interesting. They're all tied into Ukraine from past endeavors. So I think that plays a big role. And a couple more things. The fact that they couldn't shut up. Me and Alexander actually did a show about this, and we likened it to the movie A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson actually gets up in court and he says, yeah, I ordered the code red. And in that, it's the feeling that, you've done something wrong, but you have to say it. You want to say it. You're dying to admit that I'm the one that blew up that pipeline, and there's not a damn thing that Germany or the EU or anybody can do about it. And you heard that in the first comments from Blinken when it happened. He came out and said, this is a tremendous opportunity. Joe Biden said the comments that you mentioned, Danny, a couple of weeks before this happened, with Scholz standing right next to him. Victoria Nuland said this as well before it happened as well. And just a couple of weeks ago in Congress when she was speaking to Ted Cruz. And you know what this is like to me? This is like getting the info, the testimony from one of the security guards at the Epstein prison. You know what happened. You kind of have a feeling what went down, but you just don't know all the details and all the people involved. It's like just getting the final pieces in place and just having someone who was there and to say, okay, well, this is what happened in the prison. This is how we hid the cameras. This is how we blacked out everything. And this is how it was done. And you're kind of like, oh, okay. So I kind of knew this is what went down, but now it makes sense. And to me, when you read the article from Hersh, it makes sense. I'm not saying it's 100%. It's to be believed. I don't know. But when I read it, I say, okay, this really makes sense. I mean, there's motive and there's planning And if you ask the question, cui bono for the United States, for Biden, for Norway, it makes sense why Norway got involved. It makes sense why they went to Norway. It makes sense why they got Sweden involved, Denmark. The pieces kind of fall into place. So, everyone should read the article and decide on their own whether it's accurate.
Yeah, one of the things, and you mentioned the 4 individuals, Biden, Blinken, Newland, and Jake Sullivan driving this ship. And that would make sense too, because the Pentagon has had, right, when it even, they've had some Joint Chiefs of Staff has had some hesitation about a forever war in Ukraine. There have been at least some mumblings about that and some straight disagreements between the Defense Department and the State Department. But one of the things I'd like you to comment on too is this. According to Hersh, he's saying that this was being planned in December of 2021, so months before Russia officially launched its special military operation, which of course gave, I'm sure, huge impetus for them to accelerate this plan. But for me, it feels like it bursts this bubble, and it is also suspicious, as Alexander, you mentioned, that they won't comment on this right now. And this also reminds me of something I was thinking about during Biden's State of the Union. I know you two covered it a bit, but when I was looking through the transcript, I watched a bit of it, but I couldn't wait. I was waiting for him to get to foreign policy. Didn't really get there until it took a long time. I think he was at least 2/3 done with his speech before he even spoke about it. But it was a little, very small reference to Putin's invasion. There were some references that Putin's to blame for inflation and all these other things scattered about. But a central focus was Putin's invasion bad. China is our competition. And that was about it. And it felt like it was almost avoiding what is really going on in Ukraine right now and how things are turning out. And the lack of response to this bombshell article, whether it's 100% true or just partially true, the fact that they won't acknowledge it also raises eyebrows, in my opinion. It's almost like they're ignoring it. I don't know. I would love for you two to comment on that as well.
Well, just briefly, 2 things. First of all, they don't want to come out and deny it, because if they deny it, then, of course, they're putting themselves in great difficulties because they know it's true. That has to be, to my mind, the reason why they're not denying it. If they come out, they state it's not true, and it turns out it is, they're caught in a flat-out lie. And bear in mind, since we're talking about illegality, you would compound the illegality if you did that, because you could argue that lying to something like that, it's obstruction of justice, and that might create a whole new trail of legal problems. And by the way, I should say illegal. I'm not sure it's a crime. I mean, there's always that distinction, but I suspect it is, and I suspect that there are congressional matters as well, issues of prerogative, violating congressional prerogatives, which I'm not going to get into. But anyway, it would be an obstruction. It would make it still more serious. At the same time, if you came out and brazenly admitted that it was true, then, of course, you are admitting that you committed an illegal and unconstitutional act. So these people are not prepared to do that. They are doing exactly what Alex said. They say, oh, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We didn't do it, but, we would like you to realize in some way that we actually did. We can't quite restrain ourselves from bragging about it because, well, we got the thrill of doing something like this. But they've clearly got advice, and I'm sure they've had advice, and the advice has been, don't admit or deny it. Just remain silent. And I think that's actually a very revealing fact. So, as I said, you get the spokesman to deny it, and if the spokesman said things that are not true, well, who cares about them? That's the one thing. Now, the other point about this all being prepared before the war, months before the war, I think that is extremely important, because if you look at what was being discussed in December, and it is December 2021, it wasn't, just people sitting round a table and say, what are we going to do when Putin invades Ukraine? Well, let's go ahead and see whether we can perhaps take out Nord Stream 2. What Hirsch is saying is that they were actually already putting the plans together to do this thing. It was detailed planning. Now, that means that they were planning to do this thing. Now, that also means, in my mind, that the fact that the war started, the fact of the war was not the precipitating event that caused them to set up this planning committee, because it had clearly been discussed and debated previously. And I have to say, following that chain of inference, that largely leads me to think that they knew there was going to be a war and that they were intent on provoking a war, and that the decision to set up that committee, that planning committee, was part of the decision to start the war in the first place. So I think actually this is an important clue that the United States wasn't trying to prevent a war, it was trying to instigate one. I say the United States, the four people that Alex identified.
Yeah, and Russia's going to use this, aren't they?
No,
I mean,
no.
This plays right into Russia's hands, because they're going to take the statements of Merkel, the statements of Hollande, the statements of Poroshenko, the statements of Zelensky just the other day, where they said that they weren't going to honor the Minsk agreements, and the Minsk agreements was just a way to buy time. They're going to couple it with this article from Seymour Hersh. Seymour Hersh is not Alex the blogger. I mean, this guy is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who has broken more stories than I can count. They're going to take his story and they're going to say, well, there you go. You see, we were provoked into a war, because the narrative is that this war was unprovoked. And Alexander did an interview with Noam Chomsky, and they talked about how they play with the words provoked and unprovoked.
Yeah.
And they really are propagandizing the conflict around those words. Russia's war was unprovoked, but the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq, well, that was perfectly fine. So they are playing around with these words, but Russia's going to take this revelation, if you want to call it that, from Hersh, and they're going to say, you see, they were planning this stuff way back in 2021. So I mean, it plays right into Russia's hands and right into the narrative that Russia is creating, and it's a narrative that is starting to win favor. If it already has won favor with a lot of the planet, but it is starting to gain a lot of traction with a lot of people outside of Europe and the United States. For the leadership, I mean, not the people, the leadership of the collective West. They don't want to hear anything. They want to close their ears. They don't want to hear anything. Olaf Scholz, don't talk to me about Nord Stream. I don't want to hear it. But you got to imagine Modi, Xi Jinping, Lula, all of these leaders from all around the world are probably looking at this in horror, because they're seeing a United States that's banning flights to Russia, that's banning media, Europe, a collective West that's doing this, that's seizing assets, that's freezing foreign currencies, that's blowing up pipelines. I mean, this is a nightmare for the United States, and everything that Biden is doing is destructive for the United States of America. And maybe people don't see it now, but a year or two or three in the future, down the line, people are going to say, well, this guy, look what he did to our country. Look what he did to the dollar. Look what he did to our reputation in the international community. I mean, this was such a, I was going to use the word bonehead idea, but it's beyond that. It really shows real problems, like real problems.
Yeah. Yeah, and you had unnamed CIA officials in Seymour Hersh's article, according to him, say this might be a bad idea. The future of the CIA, like this might be a bad idea if we're caught. If we're caught, what is the political fallout? It'll be very interesting to see what the political fallout is. I'm wondering if you could just help viewers, especially viewers of my channel and all of those who are catching this program, get a refresher on what the significance of the downing of the Nord Stream pipelines were. Because 3 of the 4 were destroyed in this sabotage attack that now is looking like increasingly, I think we all were, whoever was paying attention was assuming that the United States, cui bono, all of that was either heavily involved or directly instituted this attack. But, you know, I think for especially Americans, I live in the United States, it's probably hard to see what the significance of destroying this pipeline really is. You were saying, Alex, that Olaf Scholz was right next to Joe Biden February 7th, 2022 at the presser. And Joe Biden was telling the press, the Western media, the U.S. media, that they were going to find a way to put a stop to a pipeline that benefits primarily Germany. I mean, it benefits Russia, of course, Russia in majority stake, but let's be honest, it was Germany. I know you've covered this well. It was Germany that came on its hands and knees and said, please, Russia, help us get cheap gas. Could you talk about what the significance of this has been? And maybe this can begin also the conversation of what is the broader significance of this conflict as we reach the 1-year point?
Right. Well, let's start about this. I mean, Germany still is a major industrial manufacturing power, the core of the German economy, the spine, if you like, of the German economy, but also a great deal of the self-conception of German society is based around manufacturing. Now, Germany is a very cohesive society, very stable country, but that's largely because it's got this extremely modern, very efficient, very competitive industrial manufacturing base. Now, what makes the German manufacturing base competitive? Well, first of all, it's modern, it's sophisticated, it's advanced, it's all those things. We accept that. It's also got an advantage, a structural advantage, in that it's got a captive market within the Eurozone, and also the euro is less strong than probably the Deutschmark would be. So that makes German goods cheaper on international markets. But there is one other key component. Now, Germany has committed itself to reducing its carbon footprint. I mean, remember, green politics, to all intents and purposes, started in Germany. And whatever your views about those, Germans have internalized these ideas to a degree that is probably greater than in any other country. So they moved away from coal, they moved away from oil, they moved away from nuclear power. They had to find some way of reducing their carbon footprint. They found that the alternative technologies weren't able to do that as quickly as perhaps they would have liked. So what they did was they went to Russia and they said, we want to buy gas. Gas has a much lower carbon footprint than other fossil fuels. It's cheap. It's very efficient. And of course, the Russians have it in plentiful quantity. So over the last 40 plus years, Germany has been increasingly reorienting its energy around gas. Now, the other problem that then arose is that starting from the sort of mid-2000s, it became very clear that gas flowing to Germany across Ukrainian pipelines which had been built by the Soviet Union, by the way, was becoming unreliable because Ukraine was in the habit of siphoning off gas that was intended for Germany and was getting itself into repeated arguments with Russians over gas prices. And this was sometimes leading to interruptions of gas from Russia to Germany. So the Germans, after this happened, started coming along to the Russians and said, look, let's cut out the transit states, the middle states, the states that these pipelines pass through. Let's build your gas pipelines directly to us in Germany across the Baltic Sea. And if you do that, we will get the gas directly. That will mean that we have cheap, competitive fuel at a low carbon footprint. Europe, anyway, is gradually switching to gas. Russia's the biggest producer of gas. It will make Germany the big energy hub in Europe, which is something which people have never quite understood, but it was an important factor. So it will strengthen our position within the European Union. And of course, by providing us with cheap energy, it will make our position, our industrial manufacturing base, more competitive. Of course, what that did as well was that it created a commonality of interest between Germany and Russia. And that was something that some countries, the United States, Poland, Britain, couldn't ever bring themselves to accept, because their nightmare, going all the way back to the Second World War, is that the Germans and the Russians will start to work together. They'll develop a commonality of economic interest that will work into a commonality of political interest, in which case that could, given the power of each of these countries and the fact that each of them is a major European economic political power, taken together, they have an overwhelming power. That would, of course, if that were ever to happen, it would dominate Europe and would perhaps start to push the United States to the margins. I have always believed that the underlying cause of the Ukrainian crisis was this concern about the German-Russian relationship solidified by the Nord Stream pipelines. So blowing up those pipelines breaks that relationship between Germany and Russia, or at least that's the idea. Getting a war there sets Germany against Russia. And the result is it puts the United States, Britain, Poland, to some extent France, Norway as well, all these countries in a stronger position, not just in relation to Russia, but in relation to Germany as well. So it's got multiple levels of importance.
Yeah, and the myth that you hear from a lot of the mainstream media, which is that this was Putin's pipeline and Putin was using the pipeline to gain control of Germany and of Europe, is a flat out lie. It was Angela Merkel, it was the Germans that approached the Russians, and they begged Putin to go ahead with Nord Stream 2. They wanted it. And actually Putin, the Kremlin, they were apprehensive about Nord Stream 2. And there were a lot of advisors to Putin who were like, no, this is not a good idea. Let's not build another pipeline that goes through Germany. But at the end of the day, Putin made the decision after a lot of diplomacy and convincing from Angela Merkel. He made the decision to go ahead with it. So, I mean, we did many shows, I remember, months before the conflict started. And we talked a lot about Nord Stream 2. And we did many shows where we said that if Nord Stream 2 goes offline, then the U.S. is going to get what they want. Because we thought that all the tension that was being built up, all the rhetoric that was driving this situation towards a war, all focused around the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And in a way, we kind of see that that's exactly what happened. It's that NATO mantra: keep Germany down, keep Russia out, and keep the U.S. in.
Absolutely. Can I just give just two little detailed points about this? In 2014, Russia adopted a policy: no more pipelines to Europe, because of course they'd already started the sanctions. The Europeans were trying to impose something called the third energy package. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but this is all about regulating Russian pipelines, and the Russians weren't happy with that. So the Russians said, no more pipelines to Europe, none at all. We're not building any more pipelines to Europe. A year later, Merkel comes along and persuades Putin to reverse that policy, to build Nord Stream 2. Putin agrees, and the reason he agrees to that is because 6 weeks before, Merkel had signed off on the Minsk agreement. the two events are connected because Putin thought, or was led to think, that with the Minsk agreement, this conflict over Ukraine is going to be settled. So given that it's going to be settled, I can accept Merkel's assurances that there's not going to be any trouble over Nord Stream 2. And as Alex absolutely correctly says, he overrode many of his advisors, and I believe the leadership of Gazprom, the Russian gas monopoly, and he signed off on this thing because, to be frank about Putin, he's had a blind spot for Germany over many years. He speaks German. He once served there, long ago. But the Minsk II agreement and the decision to go for Nord Stream 2, in Putin's mind, was connected. So now he knows Minsk II wasn't for real. Merkel herself says that. And of course, the Americans have blown up Nord Stream 2. And the Germans, what are they doing? How are they responding? They're behaving like the three monkeys. Can't see, can't hear, won't speak.